Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Ted Gardner, and I'm an interviewer for the Library of Congress Oral History Project that's so capably run here at our wonderful public library in Cincinnati. Dennis Daly, historian, is our videographer, and we have the pleasure this morning to talk to an old friend, Charlie Stix, who is one of the best-spirited guys I know. Great sense of humor, wonderful stories to tell. And what we're doing here today is to put him on record so that there'll always be a trace of Charlie Stix as long as the world exists. And Charlie, where were you born?
Jewish Hospital, Cincinnati, Ohio, March 6, 1925.
1925. Okay, so you're 85 years old.
Yes, sir.
Right, wonderful. Well, at that time, Jewish Hospital was where?
Burnett Avenue
in
Avondale.
Right.
Pill Hill.
Pill Hill.
That's where all the hospitals were located in that area.
Right. Well, that was a wonderful facility, I know, and so many great Cincinnatians spent time in and out of there over the years. Tell me about your family.
Well, if you want to start in 1840, or do you want me to go back a little earlier?
Yeah.
My family came from Demmelsdorf, Germany, which is a small farming community crossroad about 18 miles from Bamberg, which is a very historic German city in Bavaria. And apparently my great-great-grandfather, who took the name Stix when it was required by Napoleon that all Jews had to have first and last names for conscription purposes, he took the name Stix, and we never were able to figure out why he took it. But when my wife and I were there 2 years ago, I looked in the telephone book in Bamberg, and there were about 6 Stixes. So I asked our guide to do a little research and find out if maybe we were related. Well, he came back to me about 2 weeks later and said, no, he said, all of the Stixes there are Catholics, and they have no knowledge at all of any of the historic relevance with the Stix family in Bamberg. So I determined that what happened was when Napoleon decreed that all men had to have last names, Solomon, whose name was just Solomon up to that point, took the name Stix because he must have sold either cattle or milk to a resident of Bamberg. And the resident must have treated Mr. Stix with courtesy. So when it was decreed that he had to have a last name, he took Stix because it was easy to remember, easy to spell, easy to say. And that's the only reason I can come up with that. But from this small farming community, about 5 of my great uncles and my great-great-grandfather emigrated to Cincinnati in 1840. They came down the Ohio River on the barge. And the first Stix who was here was Louis Stix in 1840, and he carried some tin implements which had been given to him by somebody in New York, and he walked out to Montgomery, Ohio, and he started to visit the farmhouses out in that area to supply things to farm ladies like sharpeners and pots and pans. They didn't have those, that they couldn't go to a store. And then he got enough money together where in 1841 and 42 he brought over his entire family, including his parents. And from there they founded a store in Cincinnati called Louis Stix and Sons, which was down near the river, and eventually went up to, I think it was 6th and Walnut, where the old Playboy Club was. And they did about $30 million back in the Depression era, and then they disbanded the store in about 1927. And then my father has always been in the shoe business, as my grandfather had been a shoe jobber. And Dad joined U.S. Shoe Corporation in 1941, and it was just natural that I would go into the shoe business after I got out of college and got out of service. And so that's how we got to Cincinnati.
How you got started. Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother, Bob, who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he also had retired from USU Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
His claim to fame was that he got an option to try out with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he went to Vero Beach, and they offered him a B club in California to join, but he decided that shoe business would be probably better over the years for him than the
More solid career. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, and of course, as you and I know, that I know your brother. I've known your brother Bob for a long time, but anyway, moving along, you went to elementary school in Avondale.
There was a private school, university school, which was
Heard about that.
Blair and Hartford Avenue,
Yeah.
and that's where my parents sent me. And in 1937, there was a flood here in Cincinnati that wiped out my father's factory in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And he told me one day, well, we're going to have to pull you out of private school and send you to Walnut Hills High School.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty upsetting at that age. I was in the 7th grade going into the 8th grade. So I went to Walnut Hills, and it turned out to be a blessing because I've been very active in Walnut Hills for many, many years.
I know, it was a great school, too.
And it gave me a great education and met a lot of wonderful people.
I should say. Well, that's wonderful. Now, you know, in everybody's life, there are certain dates that stand out in one's memory. Where I was when blah, blah, blah happened. Where were you when Pearl Harbor happened?
My fraternity was playing football at North Avondale School in Avondale.
Mm-hmm.
And after we played football, we went to a young man's house for our meeting. It was called the Round Towners, was the name of the fraternity. Somebody had a radio on in the house and came down and said, we'd been attacked. Who's been attacked? The United States has been attacked. Where? Pearl Harbor. Where is that? We never heard of it. Well, it's in Hawaii. Oh, Hawaii. And that was our introduction to World War II.
Yeah, that's a very common but unforgettable moment in one's life. So by this time, you were in college.
No, I was in high school.
You were still in high school.
Yeah, I was a junior in 1941.
Oh, sure.
Because I graduated in 43.
Right.
So I was really a sophomore.
Right.
And then when I turned 17, in February of 1943, I decided to enlist in the Marine Corps. I still hadn't graduated, but I felt very strongly that I wanted to be in a cutting edge unit in World War II. And I felt the Marine Corps had been and probably was at that time the cutting edge of any military force.
Absolutely.
So I went down to the courthouse, the federal building, and got the applications and came home, and my father signed my mother's name, and I took them back down to the building, and they swore me in and said, well, we're going to let you graduate from Walnut Hills High School. You'll be 18 at that time, because I was 18 on March 6th. So I enlisted when I was 17 and went on active duty July 1st, 1943. And they sent me to the University of Rochester in V-12. V-12 was a naval abbreviation for an officer training course that was going on throughout many universities in the United States. And going into the University of Rochester, which at that time was one of the 5 heaviest endowed universities in the United States, I was thrown in with a bunch of college kids who already were sophomores and juniors and seniors in college and had gone into the V-12 program. And the physics and the math and the engineering drawing, and I was just 18 years old. It was too tough. I mean, I just was completely frustrated by the learning experience of trying to go from high school into the Marine Corps and also into college at the same time.
Yeah.
So I flunked out after about 6 months, but I was in terrific shape physically because we had a great physical training program at the University of Rochester. I had my uniform. I looked like a Marine. So from that point on, I went down to Parris Island. In the train station in Buffalo, transferring from Rochester to, well, this took place when I had one liberty in the entire time I was in service, and that was Christmas of 1943. And I came home, but I stopped in Buffalo, and I was walking through the lobby of the train station, and a man came up to me and said, "Marine, I was in the Marine Corps in World War I. Would you like to have all of my emblems?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He sent me all of his emblems, including one that I have on my overseas cap, which dates back to 1918. So all my emblems were absolutely 100% brass.
Wow.
And to this day, I'm proud of wearing a Marine emblem that dates back to that date.
Oh,
so I had that one liberty in Cincinnati, and which was enjoyable. Then went back to Rochester, flunked out, and they sent me down to Parris Island, South Carolina in January of '44.
Well, what a learning experience.
It was.
My goodness, I should say. Well, and to have those precious metals of the past and so forth, probably something from bellow wood and the argon where the Marines fought in World War I.
Well, in order to maintain the continuity, as you pointed out, I sent my uniform, my greens, dress greens, with all my ribbons and medals to my 11-year-old grandson who lives in Santa Cruz, California, so that I don't know whether he'll ever wear it or ever show it, but he's got it.
Isn't that's wonderful? Well, those things like that are so important. And again, a continuity and an awareness of history. Okay, now, so you were back at Rochester, and then, as we say, you're washed out, and where did they send you?
Sent me down to Parris Island,
Parris Island.
There were two Marine Corps boot camps, one in San Diego,
Right.
which we used to refer to as the Hollywood Marines, because the runway that comes down to San Diego goes right by the side of the San Diego Marine Corps recruit depot. So they sent me down to Parris Island, assigned me to a platoon of about 50 men, 25 could not read or write. And I was in great shape. Most of these guys weren't. So it was easy for me to acclimate myself to recruit training.
Be a leader.
And one of the highlights of my Marine Corps tour of duty at Parris Island was one day I was walking down the company street and I see a car, green Chevrolet coming, a camouflage car with a star coming on, and the star was on a little pedestal on the running board, and I could see there was a general in there and a couple colonels, and I quickly came up with my finest salute, and I got the salute back from the general and the colonel.
Wow.
And I thought, what an experience, going through Parris Island and forcing them to salute me.
How about that?
But the darkest part of my experience at Parris Island was the fact that you were not supposed to stray from your area where your barracks is. And one day I crossed a line into another area, and there was a sergeant who was in charge of policing the area, and he came up to him and he said, "You're out of your area, come with me." Well, I didn't know where I was going. I was very naive at that time. I thought, well, is he going to give me a medal, or is he going to... He takes me over to the head. Now, the head is a military Navy word for the toilet area. And in the toilet area, they had a large trough with salt water running the length of the beginning of the toilet area all the way to the end of it. So he handed me a pair of rubber gloves and a wire brush, and he said, "Now, Private, turn the water off and lift up all those slats that are on the top of the trough, and you're going to scrub that trough down to the very end." And I said, "Yes, sir," and I did it. But it taught me a valuable lesson when you're in the military or even as a civilian, there are rules and regulations which you do not break. And if you break any of them, you're bound someday to be picked up, and you'll have to do your time for doing those things. And so it taught me a very valuable lesson. I never resented it. It was my fault. I did it. I admitted it, and I took my punishment.
Absolutely. Wow. Yes, that was, well, obviously, things of that nature were inculcated in you long before you got into the Marines. I mean, this is old family and proper raising and so forth.
Well, one of the things that helped, you reminded me that when I was 9 years old, my parents sent me to a camp called Camp Wanaki in Cass Lake, Minnesota, which was owned by a minister named Dr. Slutz from Dayton, Ohio. And it was all boys. There was no running water, no electricity, no ice other than what they got out of the lake in the winter time. And he bought all World War I equipment, like pup tents, and he would give an inspection every day of your cabin and a general inspection on Saturday. Now, I was 9 years old, and I went to this camp for 5 years. And I lived outside. We took canoe trips up into Canada. It was highly disciplined. I learned how to swim. I learned the value of being prepared. It taught me a lot. And then after 5 years, they sent me to a ranch in New Mexico where I became a cowboy. We were trying to build a school for the Spanish Americans who lived in the San Cristobal Valley. San Cristobal is about 20 miles from Taos, New Mexico. So that was another 3 years of wonderful outdoor experiences. So really, when I got into the service, I had had a lot of outdoor living. And the toughest problem of guys who went into the Marine Corps that I saw were the farm guys, the big, husky, big guys. They had a hard time acclimating themselves to military. The guys who could acclimate themselves were the toughies who came from Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, who were members of gangs. They were streetwise, and they knew how to handle themselves.
Sure.
So that was a dichotomy. You would have thought the opposite. The big raw-boned farm guys would be terrific military. They weren't.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And of course, as you point out, the farm boys, despite their physical stature and so forth, lived somewhat of a free type of a life.
They were
Because
isolated.
They had to adjust to this and adjust to that.
They were isolated to their farm and the schoolhouse they went to.
Right. How about that? That's very interesting. Well, then where do we go from San Diego?
Parris Island.
Oh, you're back at.
Yeah.
You've gone from San Diego.
I'm
to
in
Paris.
Parris Island, and they give you a questionnaire that they want you to answer. What would you like to do next in the Marine Corps? They gave you some choices. So I took the choice of going to Combat Intelligence School, which was at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. We took the train up there, and I went through the 2 months of training in Jacksonville. When I got finished with Combat Intelligence School, I was asked whether I would like to go into Aerial Interpretation School. And I said no. I said I enlisted in the Marine Corps to kill Japs, and I intend to do that, and I'd like to go overseas. So at that very moment, there was a group out on jungle warfare, which I joined, out in the field, and went through 2.5 or 3 weeks of jungle warfare. The toughest part of that was you had to go into a tent filled with tear gas, and you had to have your gas mask, and you had to bring your gas mask up and put it over your face in order to breathe. I never could do it properly and went out of there with tears streaming out of my eyes. Fortunately, the Japanese never used gas, or the chances are I never would have survived. But Combat Intelligence School was typical of a lot of the military schools that they had during World War II. They taught you how to read a compass. They taught you how to recognize a Jap plane. You were supposed to be a forward observer where you could go up and oversee a Japanese encampment and tell what kind of troops they were, what kind of weapons they had, and so on. And after 2 months of doing this, I thought I knew a lot, but I really didn't. I never was able to read a compass properly to find my way out of anything. Or even recognize a Japanese plane, whether it was a Betty or what other kind of airplane it was. You go through these courses very fast, but actually until you get into combat, these things don't really hit you as being extremely important.
Exactly. But so you learned how to be a marksman.
I was a marksman at Parris Island. You go through your rifle.
Right, and of course that was very, very important in your training and in your in your combat experience. So then from Parris Island, you went back to the West Coast?
No, Parris Island to Camp Lejeune.
Yeah, Camp Lejeune.
And then I volunteered to go overseas.
Right.
And I went over with the 61st Replacement Battalion, a group of men who had not been assigned to any unit. We were to go to Pearl Harbor, to the transit center, and they would assign us to where we were supposed to go. And when we took the train from Camp Lejeune to Norfolk, Virginia. Now that train ride was really something because they had no air conditioning. There were thousands of us on this train. You couldn't put the windows down very far. All the cinders and ash would come inside. It was not a very comfortable train, not the kind that you would expect. And then our train pulled up right at dockside at Norfolk. And here's this huge ship, USS Baxter, APA 64, commissioned to carry 1,200 men. There were 10,000 of us climbing aboard this ship. I mean, you can imagine the skipper of that ship looking down from the bridge saying, "What the heck is going on here?" We were assigned down 5 different holes, all the way down. And it was humid at night. And there was only one fan for like 20 guys. So all night, guys would get up and move the fan on themselves. 2 meals a day. You had to stand in line for your food. You'd go to the galley, you'd get your plate, you'd go into where they were serving the galley, you'd put your tray down on a pedestal, there were places for 4 men, you'd gobble down the food, you'd go back up on deck, and you waited for the next meal, because there were only 2 meals a day.
Sure.
Right out of Norfolk, 99% of these guys, all of us got sick. I never got sick on the ocean. I used to feel a little bit sick. I never got sick. But here are 10,000 guys who were sick. And you can imagine what went on with 10,000 guys on a very confined ship getting sick. The only exercise we got was when they called Marines man your brooms, and then you had to clean and wash down the deck. That was the exercise. But I found a place to hide on board this ship. And it was a locker on the deck, which held all the cleaning equipment. And I used to hide in there reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which I had brought with me, which was sort of nice. I loved the ocean. And all the way to Pearl Harbor, there was a destroyer circling us at all times. Mm-hmm. We went through the canal, and of course, the Panama Canal was very interesting. The only people who got off the ship were corporals and above, or guys who jumped ship and went ashore. And since I didn't do things like that, I stayed aboard the ship. And it wasn't a bad trip to Pearl Harbor. And when we got there, the first thing they do, they take you and interview you. They look at what your service record, what you had said you had done as a civilian. And they saw in my service record that I had been a truck driver. So they assigned me to the 3rd Armored Amphibian Battalion, which was being formed on Pavuvu in the Russell Islands. The only truck I'd ever driven was a 1.5-ton Dodge out in New Mexico. But it saved my life. The other thing that saved my life is the 61st Replacement Battalion was formed with men whose last name started with H and went through Z. The 59th Replacement Battalion, which went before me, those guys in combat intelligence that went through school with me participated in Guam and Tinian, and most of them were killed going in. Because my name began with S, I went in with the 61st Battalion. That helped save my life. And then when the truck driver thing came up on my application papers, they assigned me to a tank battalion, and that saved my life.
Really?
Yes. So those were the two things that I attribute.
So you drove a tank?
No, when I got there, all of the major positions had been taken by older Marines who had gone through tank school and who had been in the very beginning formation of the battalion. I became an ammunition passer. I was supernumerary, an extra one. So I spent my days in Pavuvu in the Russell Island picking up coconuts, rotted coconuts that were in the tank park, because I don't know if you've ever smelled a rotted coconut. It's horrible.
Terrible.
And I spent my days doing that.
Gosh.
Then we went to Guadalcanal for some work on our way before we went to Peleliu. We were training to invade Peleliu, which we did on September 15th, 1944. So we went to Guadalcanal on maneuvers, and our tanks would go, of course, into the hole of the LST and then out. Our tanks could float. We had 37 millimeter gun on the turret, and then the LVTA-4 was an upgrade, and they had a 75 millimeter howitzer later on. But we practiced our landings and takeoffs from the LST. I guess one of the most beautiful nights I ever spent in my life was sitting on a 100-gallon fuel barrel filled with aviation fuel. And it was a beautiful night off Guadalcanal, and the moon was full, and it was shining off the phosphorus in the water, and it was just peaceful and gorgeous. And I looked at the shore and the horrible things that went on when the Marines invaded Guadalcanal, which was in 1942, I think, in the fall of 42. And you could see silhouettes of sunken barges and so on off the shore. And from there, we went then up to invade Peleliu, which was on September 15, 44.
Which was a terrible campaign.
Yes, I was an island about 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. And the Japanese had had control of that since World War I. And they had taken the island and fortified it like a fort. They had built tunnels in the coral underground, interlocking tunnels, so they could live like ants under the ground, and you couldn't see them. Our ships pounded the heck out of Peleliu prior to the landing. I didn't go into D+3 because I was a supernumerary, an extra man. But I was able to get up into the control tower of the LST and hear all the conversations that were going on between the ships and the pilots who were bombing it. It was a good vantage point. And the landing was a very tough one for our battalion because the Japanese could come out of their caves, zero in with their mortars on our tanks coming ashore. It was open season. It was like hunting for quail, and the quail were all in front of you. And they'd then go back into their caves and rearm what they were shooting at us. They had big guns that they were in caves. They'd roll them out on rails. They'd shoot and then roll them back in. We couldn't even spot them from spotter planes. So there were there were 10,000 Japanese, and there were, I guess, the 1st Marine Division, which was, I guess, at that time about, I don't know, maybe total of 5,000 men, somewhere between 5 and 10, somewhere in that area. And when I got ashore on D+3, there was, I didn't know where to go. There were dead Japanese everywhere. I'd never been on this island before. So I walked up to division headquarters, which I spotted, and Colonel Boyer, who was our CO, our commanding officer, I saw him. I said, "Colonel, I'm in your 3rd Armored Amphibian Battalion. What do you want me to do?" He said, "Son," he said, "just go down to the beach and climb on one of our tanks." And I did that, and I was on there for 3 days. The most horrible experience occurred to me on that tank, because when I reached to brush my teeth that night, I realized I'd left my toothbrush back on the LST. So all the time I was on Peleliu, I had to brush my teeth with salt water in my finger. I couldn't practice good hygiene, could I?
No, I should say no. Your family doctor or dentist would be horrified by that.
But-
Well, now when you were on that tank, you were in the battle. And
Well, our tanks had the ability to lead the infantry into the beach and
Right.
proceed about 100 yards inland if they could go inland that far. The infantry would come in back of us in Higgins boats and LVTs. They'd unload their men, and the men then would go ashore and get themselves positioned on the beach and then inland. Then our tanks were then to turn around, facing our guns out to sea in case the Japanese tried to counterattack. Well, they didn't do any counterattacking at Peleliu. That came later on Okinawa. So actually we didn't do anything except float in the water at night and try and get some sleep. But then we became infantry. They took away our tanks. They weren't good for anything on Peleliu. Took away our tanks and we became infantry. And the first day that I was going forward across the airfield towards where the combat was, I saw hospital jeeps going back and forth with wounded Marines. Now this was the period when blacks were not allowed to serve in the Marine Corps other than as stretcher bearers, or stevedores, stevedores. And I was amazed because these black stevedores were volunteering to go out with these Jeep ambulances and bring back wounded white boys. And I thought, that's terrible. They wouldn't allow them to carry a rifle and serve, but they were willing to give their lives to take care of us. And then I saw an older man who, at my age, then I was 18, this guy looked like he was 60. His name was Paul Douglas, and he was hanging on to the Jeeps and bringing wounded back too. Well, eventually he got wounded, and we had to take him out with one of our tanks to a hospital ship. Paul Douglas was the adjutant of the 1st Marine Division. He had enlisted as a private, and they said either you become an officer or you're going to have to get out of the Marine Corps. So he became a lieutenant and then a captain. He later on, he was a professor at the University of Chicago in economics, and then he was elected to the Senate, Senator Paul Douglas.
Sure.
And after the war, he appeared here in Cincinnati, gave a talk, and I went backstage and said, well, Senator, my battalion evacuated you from Peleliu to a hospital ship.
Oh.
And he said, thank you, son. But from that point on, we became riflemen. I was assigned to a machine gun with two other gentlemen, 2 other young Marines. And we were to keep the Japs from infiltrating our lines during the night. So that was...
The nighttime was terrible.
It was horrible. We had a swamp on our starboard side, and I would be looping hand grenades all night because I felt that the Japanese, I'd be a perfect place for them to creep up and cause a lot of damage. And then I had a foxhole in the back with a corrugated tin roof on the top of it. And one night I was sleeping up there and I heard something scratching across my corrugated tin roof. I grabbed my knife. I didn't know what was happening. I pulled the corrugated back a little bit. It was a huge land crab going across the corrugated tin. But it was a rough time on that machine gun. We were too far away from the Japanese to hit them with direct fire. They'd come out in the mornings to get water, and they were wearing loincloths, their split shoes, but you were too far away to hit them. And they'd wave at you.
Really?
And it infuriated you because you couldn't hit them.
Sure, you were frustrated.
But the 2 gentlemen that I was on a machine gun with, one of them on Peleliu was killed because when we were up on Umagadi Mountain or something, somebody yelled that there was a Japanese cave with souvenirs, and all he didn't have a shirt on, didn't have a helmet, he had a sidearm, a .45. He runs down and he shot right through the temple, and he staggered around for a minute and said, I'm okay. Bam, he just dropped dead. And the other guy who was with us on that machine gun got a Dear John letter on his way to Okinawa and killed himself with an M1 rifle on the way. So
Really?
the 2 guys I was with met untimely deaths.
I should say, how sad.
But after serving as a machine gunner, we went back to the rest area to rest for a while. And then the 81st Army Wildcat Division was assigned to help us because we were losing men so badly. And I was assigned as a stretcher bearer with the 81st Wildcat Division. So I'm up on this ridge, and a lieutenant comes up to me and he says, "Private," he said, "dig me a foxhole." I said, "Lieutenant," he said, "you're nuts. That's solid coral. Now you want a foxhole? Dig it yourself." He had no control over me. He was in the Army. I was in the Marines.
Sure.
And I remember it was terrible up there. It was a stench of bodies. And if you tried to eat a sea ration, you'd take your fork and you'd open up the sea ration, and by the time you would get it even close to your mouth, it would be covered by flies. And then at night, the mosquitoes came out like dive bombers. And the first guy we took out first was a lieutenant in the Army who had his entire jaw shot away, and he was filled full of morphine. And as we were taking him to where he could get on a stretcher and go back to a hospital, he kept saying, "Now, fellas, I'm okay. I'm okay. Don't hurry. Keep yourself safe." And we took him to where there was a stretcher. Now, the stretcher went down the side of a mountain on a pulley and wire. And at the bottom of the mountain was a Jeep. So the Jeep would go forward to bring the stretcher down and back up to bring the stretcher back up to the top. That's the only way you could evacuate the people who needed medical help. So I was a stretcher bearer for about a week, and then they pulled us back to rest, and that was the main part of my Peleliu campaign. I learned never to volunteer for anything, sir. Keep your head down and follow orders.
And you survived.
And to this day, I don't volunteer for very much. I keep my head down and I follow orders. Ted, sir.
God bless. Well, I had a very good friend who was on Peleliu in the, I think it was the 3rd Marines. And it's part of what they call the old breed.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an older guy. He and I were college mates, but he was about 4 years older than I was because he got started late. He was a farm boy from Oregon. That's where I come from. And anyway, he lived to be 90 years old, but the last 10 years of his life, he suffered a physical condition that was related to the exposure in the tropical sun on that island. He was there for a couple of months. And as you pointed out, so many of them didn't wear their shirts, you know. They were bare-chested in that hot climate.
Well,
did you know anybody that had any troubles like that?
After the war?
Yeah.
No. The temperature usually was 100 to 120 degrees, very humid. It used to rain a little bit in the afternoon for about 25 or 30 minutes to make it more humid, make it more miserable.
Oh, yeah.
But no, you didn't drink the water. The water was very slow in coming in. The Navy made a horrible error, or maybe it was the Marine Corps plus the Navy, but in order to bring in water, they used some old 100-gallon petrol fuel these containers, and they hadn't cleaned them well enough. So all the water initially, the first few days, was brought in these containers, and everybody got sick.
Yeah.
But I don't, most of the people that I was with, I don't think they suffered after Peleliu from any of the terrible conditions. What you did get, you got jungle rot in your ears and on your arms and between your toes. and you'd always go to sick bay and they'd have to take care of you. The interesting thing is the only real problem medically that I experienced on Peleliu was some people who went sort of off their rocker. We had a Navy, a Marine Corps lieutenant from Boston who went absolutely off his rocker before we landed on Peleliu and had to be evacuated. We lost him, a wonderful guy. And then there was a career Marine who on the way into combat, he went off his rocker. And you wouldn't expect that for someone who had spent maybe 15 or 20 years in the Corps.
That experience,
Yeah.
that's right. How curious, yeah. Well, of course, it depended on the individuality of people. So you were on Peleliu how long?
Until the island was secured. We went in September 15th. It was the latter part of October that we secured the island and were able then to board ships to go back to Pavuvu to train for what we didn't know at that time would have been Okinawa. So we got on board ship and went back to Pavuvu in the Russell Islands.
Well, I want to get into the Okinawa campaign now because that, of course, was such a terrible time, and it was sort of the last stand of the Japanese. That was one of their home islands.
Well, when we got back to Pavuvu in the Russell Islands, I decided I didn't want to be wasted as an ammunition passer and a cleaner up of coconuts, so I went up to headquarters and met the Lieutenant Dysart, who was the intelligence officer. I said, "Sir, my name is Private Charles Stix." I said, "I went through combat intelligence school after Paris Island. Why don't you put me to work?" He said, "I need a clerk typist." I said, "I'm your man." So there I moved from Company D to headquarters and became a clerk typist in intelligence, our intelligence battalion. And he sent me to intelligence school for 2 weeks at the main part of the island. Well, when we got back to Pavuvu, it was October. And of course, November is Thanksgiving. Christmas is around the corner. Pardon me. We hadn't had any decent food for a long time. So on Thanksgiving, they decided we were going to have turkey. So they brought turkey and our galley fixed it. And there were 700 of us in our battalion. We all got sick. The turkey was rotten.
Oh, gee.
And there were only 3 heads, 3 toilets for the whole battalion. It was a mess. The land crabs were terrible on that place. I mean, it was a horrible place, Pavuvu. If you read stories about Pavuvu, I think some men worried more about Pavuvu and talked more about how horrible Pavuvu was than combat. So we did train, though, for Okinawa on Pavuvu in the Russell Islands. And we boarded ship there and also went then up to, we went to Ulithi. And that was the staging point for Okinawa. Ulithi, there were thousands of ships. Wherever you looked, you could see a ship. You could walk to shore on the ships. Yeah. So we, on April 1st, we went ashore on Okinawa. And no resistance. We all thought the Japanese would meet us with resistance, but there was none. We were told to dig a foxhole when we got on shore, which I did. As I was digging my foxhole, I heard some planes. I thought there were ships coming off, or planes coming off a carrier. I looked under their big red suns underneath their...
The meatball.
Yeah, they were on their way out, kamikaze pilots, to go after your ships, where you were. So we went ashore, no problems. We went up to Bolo Point with our tanks because we had to get rid of a few pockets of Japanese who stayed on the north part of the island. And it was at that point that our radio heard that Franklin Roosevelt had passed away. Oh, yes. And I don't think there was a dry eye in our battalion. We worshiped Franklin Roosevelt as our leader. I don't think there was anybody who didn't admire him. And he held the whole country together, and we felt he was our commanding officer at the top. Well, after that point, we started to move down the island towards Naha, which was the capital, located on the southernmost part of Okinawa. And on the way down, we were along the coast. We stopped one night at a field. It was called Mashinito. It was a Japanese small air, it had a runway on it for Piper Cubs, for observation planes. And we camped there. It was a sweet potato field. And that night I had dug a foxhole, I was in this hole, and all of a sudden I woke up and there were tracers coming in from the ocean and bouncing off the hill that we were behind. Lots of noise. I went right back to sleep. And the next morning I wake up to find out that the Japanese had counterattacked and come in from the ocean. And our ships were firing in, and we were firing out. And so I went up to headquarters tent, and the colonel said, "Stix, where the hell were you?" I said, "Sir, nobody woke me up."
You slept through the
I
battle.
slept through my only Japanese counterattack. But they used our tanks as artillery on Okinawa. Fortunately, we did not get into the area where all the bloody infantry catastrophe took place, where the Japanese had dug in. They had an underground city under Shuri Castle, and it took the life of thousands of young Marines who had just come out of boot camp, boarded ship, landed on Okinawa, and knocked off like this. It was horrible. Actually, the Marine Corps, 6th Division, which was there at that time, had over 120% casualties. But we worked our way down the island. We took Naha, and the infantry took care of the Japanese. And then from there, I went to Guam, where we trained for the invasion of Japan. But Okinawa was large. There were a lot of civilians on Okinawa, which there hadn't been on Peleliu. And one day I was walking in our area, and they had huge Okinawan tombs where they would bury their dead in tombs. And there were 3 women trying to get a boulder away from the entrance to this tomb so they could bring the body in and wash the bones and the flesh. So I helped them move the big stone that confronted them, and they invited me to be with them to perform this ceremony of cleansing the bones and then putting it in sake. And that was how they performed their ceremony. Nixon Denton, who was sports editor of the Cincinnati Times-Star, was a foreign correspondent. And somehow I got together with him on Okinawa. And he wrote an article about me, which appeared in the Cincinnati Times-Star. I think it was on March 6th. I think it was on my birthday, 1945. And he and I talked for about an hour and a half. He didn't take one note, Ted, not one note. And when he wrote that article, everything that I had said to him was perfect, right on the printed page. Fantastic guy.
How about that? Well, I should say that, so you were on Okinawa until
We secured the island.
it was secured.
So that was the end of May or the beginning of June, 45. And then they put me on a Liberty ship to go to Guam. And on Guam, the Marine Corps took away our tanks because we were going to go in for the invasion of Japan. We became a duck battalion. We had 4 wheels, a propeller in the back, and a hull that was empty, space for people to ride in, space to bring in supplies from the ships and so on. So we became the 20th Amphibian Duck Battalion, or Truck Battalion. And the biggest problem we had when we got to Sasebo, the tires blew out all the time. We couldn't keep the things rolling because I guess over the year, the months of these ducks have been in the Pacific, the rubber had deteriorated, and that's one of the main problems.
Oh my gosh.
But that's what we did. Our ducks would go out to the supply ships, bring back ammunition, and so on. So we landed on Okinawa, and there was not a soul anywhere in Sasebo. Sasebo was on Kyushu, the southernmost island on the archipelago, and it was a seaplane base. And we were housed in a huge hangar that had been a hangar for seaplanes. And that's where one of the most horrible experiences took place, because we had a doctor from Cincinnati who was a pediatrician. He was our battalion surgeon. He couldn't stand blood, so all the corpsmen had to perform all the surgery that took place on Peleliu and Okinawa. Well, I won't use his name on this tape because he was a very fine guy, but he just wasn't cut out to be a military doctor, particularly with the Marines. But he took a hospital jeep with one of his corpsmen down to the dock, and they commandeer a ship to go out to get one of the supply ships, and they brought back 24 steaks. They take the steaks to the hangar. Now the hangar, 700 of us were out in the center of the hangar, and then there was a partition where the office was for the hangar, but the partition didn't go all the way up to the top. It only went up to about 18 inches of the ceiling. So they took frying pans, and they put the steaks in the frying pans, and blowtorches underneath the frying pan. So the smell of these steaks going up and then over this partition and hanging over us like a cloud was enough for anybody to commit to go over the hill, to really go after whoever was doing it. It was terrible. That was the only letter I ever wrote home to my parents. I said, when I get home, we're going to invite the doctor and his wife over to our house. We're going to have filet mignons. We're going to serve them fish heads. Well, naturally, we did invite the doctor and his wife over. We had a wonderful meal back after the war was over. But that was one of the unpleasant experiences. I also had an opportunity of walking the beach on Sasebo, where we were supposed to land. Every square inch of that beach was covered with a huge tent and a large gun. We would have had no chance of surviving an invasion coming into Sasebo. So all of the revisionists who decry our use of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had never been in combat.
No.
We would have lost 1.5 million men.
Just imagine.
Positively.
To say nothing of the civilians who,
Men, women, and children. I had a chance to talk to civilians, to go into their homes.
Did you?
I actually have pictures of at home with some of these people that I met. And of course, when you talk to them about the war, they had no responsibility. It was always somebody else.
Of course.
But men, women, and children were armed to the teeth with weapons that they had for our invasion. If we had gone in as an invasion, it would have been really the end, I think.
Wow. Well, that is, from what I've read, I never got to Japan, but from what I've read in different books and reports and so forth and so on, that not only was our military have been decimated, but
Civilian population
the civilian population, millions of them, because as you point out, they were dug in. They had factories under the ground.
Absolutely.
Where they were still making airplanes.
Yes, and weapons and ammunition.
Yeah, right.
But I want to tell you how ingenious these Japanese were. One day I was walking from our area down to the bombed out center of the city where the railroad station still stood, and I hear music, and here's a tent. And in the tent are Japanese gals, very attractive, dancing with army guys, Marines, sailors. And I thought, oh, isn't this wonderful? You could, and no charge, you could walk in and dance with them. 1 week later, it cost you $5. We had taught them how to dance. They were ingenious people.
I should say.
But then from Sasebo, Japan, I boarded a ship in January, and 26 days on an LST landing ship tank from Sasebo to San Diego.
Wow.
Got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Here's the shoreline of California and San Diego. The tears come down. I never thought I'd make it back alive. I get ashore, and there's a Red Cross canteen. Now, I hadn't had a glass of milk in over 19 months. My hand was shaking. I got that glass. I spilled the first glass right down the front of me. Second glass was fine. Well, our job was to take all of the Army trucks that we had brought back on the LST and drive them out to Camp Matthews, which was a Marine Corps rifle range at that time, and drop off the tanks. You can imagine an 18-year-old sitting on top of this big 4x4 truck, open canopy, seeing this beautiful grass, wonderful streets, white houses, beautiful girls. Man, I'll tell you, that was heaven before my time.
I should say, worth fighting for.
Right. So the two tanks I had, or two trucks I had taken out, both of them died. They were before I got to the main gate. But we disbanded our battalion at Camp Pendleton. I took a train, Pullman to Chicago, to Great Lakes. I'd been made PFC on a ship coming home from Japan. There were 150 of us who had never been promoted. They made us PFCs. When I went up to get my discharge, it said corporal, and I said to the lieutenant, I'm not a corporal, I'm a PFC. Well, if you sign here, we'll make you a sergeant. I said, give me my $10 so I can take a train back to Cincinnati, sir. And that was my military experience.
Wonderful. What a story. Well, Charlie, it's not only what you experienced and what you learned and what you imparted to other people, but also the spirit that you showed and your patriotism and your devotion to your country and everything. All these things went into the making of a man. And I know how you feel that once you got back into this beautiful land and moved on in your life and career, that you could look back and say, I'm glad I did what I did.
Absolutely. I have no regrets.
Right.
I only hope that my 7 grandchildren and my 4 grown children, a certain amount of what I learned and I've talked to them about, could carry on for the rest of their lives, so the continuity can be maintained by our family for many years to come.
Well, God bless you, and it's been a great privilege to hear your story and to be a friend. And I thank you, and congratulations, and
Thank you, Ted.
keep going.
Thank you for inviting me. I do
Semper
appreciate
Fi.
it. Semper Fi, sir.